Good morning, Central Kentucky. This is Sandra Leslie White coming to you live today from WJMM Studios here just outside of Lexington, Kentucky. Shouting out to all of you around the country, WJMM.com and Facebook. Special shout out today to Randolph there in Denver, Colorado, one of my faithful listeners. He pointed out something to me yesterday after listening to this show. I want to thank him for that and talk about that a little bit today. We're going to talk about dark shadows. Dark shadows. You remember that gothic soap opera? Man, that is dating me. Don't you dare try to figure out how old I am or how old I was, like not born when it when it was popular. Let's listen to this. Creator Dan Curtis, according to Wikipedia, claimed he had a dream in 1965 of a mysterious young woman on a train. The following day, Curtis told his wife of the dream and pitched the idea as a TV series to ABC. Network officials greenlit production, and Curtis began hiring crew members. Art Wallace was hired to create a story from Curtis's dream sequence. Listen to this. Wallace wrote the story Bible, Shadows on the Wall, the proposed title for the show. Later changed to Dark Shadows. Robert Costello was added as a line producer, and Curtis took on the creator and executive producer role. Okay, don't know whether you saw Dark Shadows, a dark soap opera in the 60s that really went on in, I think, early 70s. I think you can still see those things. But anyway, the point is that we are talking about dark shadows today, but not the story Bible, Shadows on the Wall, but the story Bible, the Holy Bible, says something to us in Hosea 4 about dark shadows. So let's jump into that. Today, we're going to also look at Psalm 80:10 because this word that Randolph from Denver pointed out to me yesterday only occurs twice in the Old Testament, and I think it has something to say to us today. So let's look first, though, at Hosea 4:13. We looked at this passage yesterday. We're going to look at it again today and talk about dark shadows. In the New American Standard Version this morning, Hosea 4:13, they offer sacrifices on the tops of the mountains and burn incense on the hills under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is pleasant. Therefore your daughters play the harlot, and your brides commit adultery. Okay, if you're just tuning in, this is Sandra Leslie White. We're talking about dark shadows today and looking at this passage out of Hosea 4:13 in the context of God being really clear about what he sees under the trees. So we've talked the last couple of days about whether we're under God and finding ourselves departing from being under God. That was verse 12. Because of consulting idols and diviners, or if you want to talk about psychics or, all of their little devices. He talks about the diviner's wand, informs them, and then he goes into this spirit of harlotry. It just goes from bad to worse. And then offering sacrifices in today's passage on the tops of the mountains, burning incense on the hills. So the very top of the mountain, they offer sacrifices. And those sacrifices at this time in the latter part of the 8th century BC, these sacrifices were offered to the goddess of nature, and she was a fertility goddess, essentially the goddess of goddesses, and that it was deeply engrossed in sexual intercourse with pagan gods of the temple of the day, of the Canaanite gods. and that it really was a result of offering up also the sacrifices of young women, young girls, and women on these high mountain tops because they believed offering a virgin would be a blessing. Do you know this is still going on today in the world? This is going on today in Nepal. We're going to talk more about this in the coming shows, some opportunities to support some work there in Nepal. But there is a temple now currently that is active and offers young baby girls, usually under the age of 3, and they're sacrificed in a temple for a blessing from their gods. So we're going to be talking more about that. It's still happening today. So don't think that these gods, these pagan gods, these gods and goddesses of the darkness aren't still with us today, and I think they affect us today. So in very overt ways, like in Nepal, and very overt ways, we talk about sex trafficking, very overt ways when we look at the rich and famous, being involved in sex trafficking of young women. But these are actual sacrifices, offering up young girls and young women, virgins, and slaying them on the mountaintops, and burning incense on the hills. And then they talk about in verse 13 going on under the trees. That was yesterday's message. Under trees, under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is pleasant. Therefore your daughters play the harlot, your brides commit adultery. We'll talk again more about that in coming shows, because that moves us into verse 14. But for today, I really think it's important to talk about the shade, okay? Talking about this shade. I want to look at that word a little more closely this morning. As my friend there in Denver pointed that out to me yesterday. If you're just tuning in, was shouted out earlier to Randolph today, and one of my scholars that follow the show, and I appreciate him. And those of you who write me or text me or give me some insight into a message, I really appreciate that. So I openly welcome that from my listeners. So looking into this word, this usage of this word in 4:13, there's shade. Okay, that word is actually translated better as in the Hebrew tsel, T-S-E-L. I believe I'm pronouncing that closely. In the Hebrew, tsel, in the Hebrew, which really means a shadow. And it is a masculine noun. Its sort of phonetic spelling is T-S-A-L-E, so to sail. But it's defined as a shadow, and a dark shadow at that. It's only used twice in the scriptures. It's used here in the dark shadow, because their dark shadow is pleasant. So that's better translated than in mine in the New American Standard Version, just going into that Hebrew word. And that's so fascinating. The only other time it's used is in Psalm 80:10. And so, let's take a look at that. Psalm 80:10. I think it's so interesting when a word is only used a couple of times. To me, that, I know some of you may think if it's used over and over and over, that's more significant. To me, the fewer times a word is used in its context is more significant, because it's easier for me to get to the deeper meaning. So in Psalm 80, and this is a psalm of Asaph, according to the scholars, where God is implored to rescue his people from their calamities. Okay, so in the verse 10 that we're referencing today, it says, this is the New American Standard, the mountains were covered with its shadow. So there's the word. The mountains were covered with its shadow, and the cedars of God with its boughs. So it seems that this shadow is directly related again here with the mountain, and the cedars of God with its bows, or perhaps it's bows there. And in that context, he's crying out in verse 7, O God of hosts, restore us. Cause thy face to shine upon us, and we will be saved. Thou didst remove a vine from Egypt. Thou didst drive out the nations, and didst plant it. Thou didst clear the ground before it, and it took deep root and filled the land. The mountains were covered with its shadow, and the cedars of God with its boughs. So, again, this idea of the shadows, the dark places. The title of the message today, The Dark Shadows. So, it seems that according to most of the scholars that I reference, and I really do appreciate my Hebrew scholars as I go through Hosea, we're looking at, in this particular verse 13, that dark place, those dark shadows, that shade, that word sail, means that it is dark, and it is not necessarily dark because they need relief from the hot sun. It is dark because that is where the Canaanites and the Assyrians too, but the Canaanite gods were doing their darkest deeds. They didn't even consider sacrificing young women and girls on the mountaintops as being dark. That was just that's what they did for the day, But in the dark is where the illicit sexual behavior, all the intercourse was happening, not only with the Canaanite people, with the pagan gods, for fertility purposes, fertility of the fields, fertility of the family, supposedly for religious purposes, but that's where the prostitutes would gather. That's where the Hebrew people were drawn up into the dark shadows of these trees and participating in illicit sexual activity. And so we talked yesterday about the God who sees us under the trees, who sees us in the dark shadows. And I think I mentioned that can be a very ominous sort of revelation to many of us. I think probably people who are more secular in their understanding of God sort of assume that he sees us and they don't care. I think for those who have just a real angst, against Christianity or the God of the scriptures, they see God as this righteous judge, or really not even righteous, just this judge, this big guy, that just is out to get us. And so why not, just be in the dark shadows, why not, offer yourselves, in all your glory on the mountaintops, or burn incense on the hills, or have sex with whoever you want to, why not, because A, they don't believe in him, or B, they think, he's going to get them anyway. And so it's, I think, for us, and this is written, remember, Hosea is written for God's people. Hosea is not written for people who do not know Yahweh. Certainly in the day, it was written for the Hebrew people, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom. And so these were people who knew Yahweh. These were people who were raised in the ways of the Jewish people, of the chosen people, of the nation of Israel in the day. They knew better, and so they would go into the dark shadows. Is that where we are today? My heart breaks for many of us out there in Christendom, and I think of my own life and how I have lived in the dark shadows of life. I have lived in places and been ashamed of my own behavior and stayed in those dark shadows. And the Lord, in his awesome plans and purposes for my life and for yours, intervenes into our darkest places and sheds his light, not to expose us, although that's part of it, but also to draw us from the darkness into his glorious light, and that we taste and see that the Lord and his ways are so much sweeter and so good. So he wants to bring you and me out of the dark shadows. Let's follow him into the light, into the coming days. God bless you today.